When we look at global conflicts, we often fall into the habit of placing them in separate boxes. One war in Europe, another in the Middle East. Different causes, different actors, different consequences. It feels cleaner that way, easier to understand, but the truth is rarely that simple. And right now, that way of thinking is becoming dangerously outdated. What we are witnessing is not just two independent wars unfolding at the same time. We are watching the gradual merging of strategic interests, where actions in one region are beginning to shape outcomes in another. The war in Ukraine and rising tensions involving Iran are becoming threads in the same geopolitical fabric. And if we fail to see that connection, we miss the bigger picture entirely. At the core of this shift is a fundamental reality. Modern power is no longer confined by geography. Influence travels through alliances, through resources, through economic pressure, and through military cooperation. When one conflict intensifies, it doesn't stay contained. It sends ripples across the global system. Those ripples are now reaching from Eastern Europe deep into the Middle East. Think about it from a strategic mindset. Nations are not just reacting to events, they are constantly calculating advantages. If a country is involved in one conflict, it will look for leverage wherever it can find it. That might mean strengthening partnerships, redirecting resources, or even indirectly engaging in another region to shift the balance of power. This is where the connection begins to take shape. The Ukraine war has already drawn in major global players, creating a network of support and opposition that extends far beyond its borders. Now, as tensions rise around Iran, those same networks are being activated in new ways. The same countries, the same rivalries, the same strategic calculations, they are now operating across multiple fronts, and that changes everything. Because once conflicts become interconnected, they stop being isolated events. They become part of a larger system of pressure and response. A decision made in one region can trigger consequences in another. Support given in one war can weaken a position somewhere else. It becomes a complex game of balance, where every move carries weight far beyond its immediate context. There's also a psychological dimension to this that we cannot ignore. When nations perceive threats, they don't just respond physically, they respond mentally. They start to see patterns, to anticipate alliances, to prepare for scenarios that may not have even fully materialized yet. This creates a kind of strategic tension that stretches across borders. It's not just about what is happening, but what could happen. And that mindset drives behavior. It leads to preemptive actions, to deeper alliances, to a readiness that can escalate situations more quickly than expected. When Ukraine is supported by certain powers and Iran is opposed by those same powers, the conflicts begin to overlap in perception as well as in reality. They become part of the same narrative, a broader struggle for influence and control. What makes this even more significant is that these connections are not always visible on the surface. They operate beneath the headlines, in policy decisions, in military planning, in economic strategies. You won't always see a direct line connecting the two conflicts, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. In fact, the most powerful connections are often the ones that are least obvious. This is where we need to shift our thinking. Instead of asking, what is happening in Ukraine? Or what is happening with Iran? We need to start asking, how are these events shaping each other? Because that question opens the door to a deeper understanding. It forces us to see the world not as a collection of separate issues, but as an interconnected system. And once you see that system, you begin to understand the stakes on an entirely different level. You realize that decisions are no longer local, they are global, that consequences are no longer immediate, they are far-reaching, and that conflicts are no longer isolated, they are part of something much bigger. So the real question becomes this: if these wars are becoming strategically linked, what does that mean for the future? It means escalation becomes more complex. Resolution becomes more difficult, and the margin for error becomes much smaller, because when conflicts connect, the world doesn't just get bigger, it gets tighter, more interdependent, more fragile, and that leaves us with something to think about, something we cannot afford to ignore. When one conflict can shape another, we are no longer dealing with separate wars. We are dealing with a single evolving global struggle. Now, once we understand that these conflicts are becoming strategically connected, the next layer reveals something even more tangible, something you can measure, track, and feel in real time. And that is the movement of resources. Because war, at its core, is not just about ideology or territory. It is about capacity. It is about who has the means to sustain pressure, to defend, to endure. And here's the reality. Those means are limited. There is no infinite supply of weapons, no endless pool of funding, no bottomless reserve of political attention. Every nation, no matter how powerful, operates within constraints. And when multiple conflicts demand those same resources at the same time, something has to give. This is where the connection between Ukraine and rising tensions involving Iran becomes unmistakably real. Because as focus shifts toward the Middle East, resources, both material and psychological, begin to shift with it. And Ukraine, which has relied heavily on consistent external support, starts to feel that shift in very practical ways. Think about the nature of modern warfare. It is highly specialized. It depends on advanced systems, air defenses, precision weapons, surveillance technology. These are not things you can simply produce overnight or duplicate endlessly. They require time, investment, and coordination. And when another conflict emerges that demands those same systems, the supply chain doesn't expand instantly. It gets divided. So what happens when two critical fronts are competing for the same tools of survival? You start to see delays, you start to see difficult choices, you start to see prioritization. And prioritization in the context of war is never neutral. It reflects strategic judgment. It reflects perceived urgency. It reflects where decision makers believe the greatest risk lies at that moment. If tensions involving Iran escalate and the Middle East becomes a focal point, resources may be redirected, not because Ukraine no longer matters, but because attention has been pulled elsewhere. And attention is a resource in itself. We often underestimate the power of attention in global affairs, but attention drives policy. It drives media coverage. It drives public support. And public support, in democratic systems especially, influences how resources are allocated. When the world's focus shifts even slightly, the ripple effects can be profound. Ukraine's position then becomes more complex. It is not just fighting on the battlefield, it is also competing for sustained relevance in the global conversation. It must maintain urgency in a world where urgency is now divided. There's also a deeper psychological tension at play here. When leaders are faced with multiple crises, their decision-making framework changes. They begin to think in terms of trade-offs, not ideal solutions, but necessary compromises. And those compromises can shape the trajectory of a war just as much as any single battle. This creates a kind of silent pressure, not the visible kind you see in headlines, but the underlying strain of stretched capacity. The sense that support, while still present, may not be as concentrated, as immediate, or as consistent as before. And in war, consistency can be just as important as strength, because it's not only about what you have, it's about whether you can rely on having it when you need it most. And this is where the strategic connection deepens even further. The Iran conflict doesn't just exist alongside the Ukraine war. It actively influences the conditions under which that war is being fought. It shapes the flow of weapons. It shapes the speed of response. It shapes the level of global engagement. In a sense, Ukraine is now operating within a broader ecosystem of conflict, where its outcomes are partially dependent on events happening far beyond its own borders. And that changes the nature of resilience. It's no longer just about internal strength, but about external stability, about whether the systems supporting you remain intact under pressure. So we begin to see a new kind of vulnerability emerge. Not weakness in capability, but exposure to distraction, exposure to shifting priorities, exposure to a world where multiple fires are burning at once, and not all of them can be addressed with equal intensity. And this is not just a logistical issue, it's a philosophical one. It forces us to confront a difficult question. How do we allocate limited resources in a world of unlimited crises? There is no easy answer. Every choice carries consequence. Every decision reflects a value judgment about what matters most in that moment. And those judgments made under pressure can redefine the course of history. So as we think about this connection, we have to move beyond the surface. This is not just about weapons being sent from one place to another. It is about the structure of global support systems under strain. It is about the reality that even the strongest alliances have limits. And it is about what happens when those limits are tested. Because when resources are divided, outcomes are shaped. And that leaves us with something worth holding on to, something that speaks not just to policy, but to perspective. In a world of competing crises, it is not just power that determines the future. It is how that power is distributed when it is needed most. And once we begin to understand how strategy connects these conflicts and how resources are being stretched across them, there's another layer, quieter, less visible, but just as powerful. And that is the economic dimension. Because wars are not only fought on battlefields, they are sustained, prolonged, and sometimes even decided by economic forces that operate far beyond the front lines. Now think about this carefully. When tensions rise in the Middle East, particularly involving a country like Iran, global markets react almost immediately, not out of emotion, but out of expectation. There is a deeply ingrained understanding in the global economy that instability in that region threatens energy supply. And when energy supply is threatened, prices go up, oil becomes more expensive, transportation costs rise, inflationary pressures increase, and suddenly what began as a regional conflict starts to affect the entire world. But here's where the connection becomes strategically significant. Higher oil prices do not impact all countries equally. Some suffer under the weight of rising costs, while others, particularly those that export energy, find themselves in a position of unexpected advantage. And among those countries is Russia. Now, this is where we have to look beyond the surface and think in terms of systems. Russia's economy, especially under the strain of sanctions, depends heavily on energy exports. Oil and gas are not just commodities, they are lifelines. They generate revenue, sustain government spending, and provide the financial backbone that supports its military efforts in Ukraine. So when global oil prices rise due to instability involving Iran, something paradoxical happens. A conflict that appears geographically distant from Eastern Europe begins to indirectly strengthen Russia's economic position. It gives it more financial breathing room, more resilience, more capacity to endure. And endurance in war is everything, because modern conflicts are rarely short. They are prolonged, drawn out, and dependent on the ability to sustain effort over time. It's not just about who strikes harder, it's about who lasts longer. And economic stability plays a central role in that equation. At the same time, the countries supporting Ukraine, many of them in Europe and beyond, begin to feel the pressure from rising energy costs. Their economies tighten, their populations face higher living expenses, and with that comes political strain. Public opinion becomes more sensitive. Governments are forced to balance external commitments with internal stability. This creates a subtle but powerful shift. Support for Ukraine may still be present, but it is now operating under greater constraint. Every decision to allocate funds or resources becomes more complex, more debated, more scrutinized. So you start to see how the economic ripple effect works. On one side, rising oil prices indirectly strengthen Russia. On the other, they place additional strain on those backing Ukraine. It's not a direct transfer of power, but it is a shift in balance. And what makes this even more profound is that it happens without a single shot being fired between these regions. No direct engagement is required. The connection operates through markets, through pricing, through global dependency on energy. It is influence without confrontation. This is the nature of modern power. It is often indirect. There's also a psychological layer to this economic reality. When a country begins to feel financially strained, its decision-making changes, risk tolerance decreases, priorities shift inward, leaders become more cautious, more focused on maintaining domestic stability, and that can affect how consistently they engage in external conflicts. So again, we are not just looking at numbers on a chart. We are looking at how economic pressure reshapes behavior, how it influences alliances, how it alters the rhythm of support in a war that depends heavily on that support. And for Ukraine, this introduces another level of uncertainty. It is no longer just navigating the battlefield. It is navigating a global economic environment that can either reinforce or undermine its position, depending on forces far outside its control. This is what interconnected conflict truly looks like. Not just shared strategy, not just divided resources, but overlapping economic consequences that quietly, steadily reshape the landscape of war. And if we step back for a moment, we begin to see the deeper philosophical question beneath all of this. In a world so interconnected, can any conflict truly be contained, or does every crisis, no matter where it begins, eventually become part of a larger system that affects us all? Because that is what we are witnessing here, a chain reaction. One region influences another, which in turn shifts the balance somewhere else. It is a continuous loop of cause and effect, where the boundaries between conflicts become increasingly blurred. And in that kind of world, understanding becomes power. The ability to see connections where others see separation, that is what allows us to anticipate, to adapt, and to respond with clarity. So as we reflect on this, we are left with something that cuts deeper than economics, deeper than strategy. In a globally connected system, the true impact of a conflict is not where it begins, but where its consequences are felt. And when you bring all of this together, the strategic overlap, the competition for resources, the economic ripple effects, you begin to see that something deeper is happening, something that goes beyond pressure, beyond reaction. You begin to see transformation, because in the middle of all this complexity, Ukraine is no longer just a recipient of global support. It is evolving into something else entirely. It is becoming a contributor, a participant, in many ways, a new kind of global security actor. Now pause on that for a moment, because it's a significant shift. At the beginning of the conflict, the narrative around Ukraine was largely defined by dependency, what it needed, what it lacked, what it was asking for. And that made sense. It was under immense pressure, facing a larger adversary, relying on external backing to hold its ground. But over time, something changed. Through necessity, through adaptation, through constant exposure to high-intensity conflict, Ukraine began to develop capabilities that are now among the most advanced in modern warfare, particularly in areas like drone technology, battlefield innovation, and real-time tactical adaptation. And here's where the connection to the broader global landscape becomes clear. As tensions rise in other regions, especially in the Middle East, Those capabilities are no longer confined within Ukraine's borders. They become valuable beyond the original conflict. Other nations begin to observe, to learn, to engage. Knowledge starts to move, expertise starts to transfer. So now, instead of being only a recipient of military support, Ukraine is also becoming a source of it, not necessarily in the form of large-scale deployments, but in something just as powerful, experience. Because in modern warfare, experience is currency. It's one thing to have advanced technology. It's another to know how to use it under pressure, how to adapt it in real time, how to integrate it into unpredictable environments. And that is exactly what Ukraine has been forced to master. This creates a new dynamic, a shift from dependence to interdependence. Now, other countries, particularly those facing emerging threats, may look to Ukraine not just as a place of conflict, but as a source of insight, a testing ground for strategies, a partner in understanding how modern warfare is evolving. And this has profound implications, because it means the conflict is no longer just shaping Ukraine. It is shaping global military thinking. It is influencing how nations prepare, how they train, how they anticipate future threats. The lessons learned in one war are now being applied in others. This is how local conflict becomes global influence. There's also a deeper psychological transformation happening here. When a nation moves from a position of reliance to a position of contribution, its identity shifts. Its sense of agency changes. It is no longer just reacting to events, it is helping shape them. And that shift matters, not just for strategy, but for perception, because perception influences power. When a country is seen as capable, adaptable, and innovative under pressure, it commands a different level of respect on the global stage. Its voice carries more weight, its role becomes more defined, and its presence in international decision-making grows stronger. So now, as conflicts emerge elsewhere, including those involving Iran, Ukraine is no longer on the sidelines of global security conversations. It is part of them, actively, meaningfully, and increasingly. And this brings us back to the idea of interconnectedness, but now we see it from a different angle. It's not just that conflicts are influencing each other through pressure and limitation. They are also connected through learning, through adaptation, through the sharing of capability. One war feeds into another, not only by creating strain, but by generating knowledge. And knowledge, in the context of conflict, is one of the most powerful forces there is, because it accelerates change, it shortens learning curves, it allows nations to prepare for challenges they have not yet faced by studying those who already have. So what we are witnessing is not just a series of overlapping conflicts. We are witnessing the emergence of a more integrated global security environment where roles are fluid, where influence is dynamic, and where even nations under pressure can become sources of strength for others. And that challenges the way we think about power itself. Power is no longer just about size or resources. It is about adaptability. It is about resilience. It is about the ability to learn, to evolve, and to contribute under the most difficult conditions. And in that sense, Ukraine represents something larger than its immediate struggle. It represents a shift in how modern conflicts shape the identities of the nations involved. So as we reflect on this final piece, we are left with a perspective that ties everything together: strategy, resources, economics, and transformation. Because in the end, the true impact of conflict is not just in what it destroys, but in what it creates. And that leaves us with a final thought, one that speaks not just to nations, but to all of us observing this moment in history. In a world defined by conflict, those who learn fastest do not just survive, they redefine the future.